Hello and welcome to another video by AIA Contract Documents. In this video, we're going to be talking about the topic of programming in the context of building design. We'll be talking about programming generally, but we'll also be talking about programming in relation to a document that we at AIA Contract Documents recently updated and published, the B202 Programming Scope of Services. My name is Mike Koger, and I'm a staff attorney with the American Institute of Architects in Washington, D.C., and I am joined in this video by two guests, Colleen Telling, who is a manager and counsel with AIA Contract Documents, and Wolf Saar, who's the managing principal of VIA Architecture in Seattle, Washington. Wolf is the current chair of the AIA's Contract Documents Committee and a fellow with the American Institute of Architects. And of course, both Wolf and Colleen were heavily involved in updating the B202 programming document that we're going to be discussing in this video. As always, we can't give legal advice in this video, and nothing you hear in this video is a substitute for consulting with an attorney who is licensed in your jurisdiction who can talk with you about the specific issues that you are facing. So Wolf and Colleen, thank you very much for joining me on this video to talk about a subject that, quite frankly, I think I can learn a lot about from both of you. Maybe we should start off really basic. Wolf, can you just give us a big picture idea of what is programming and, why is it important in the, in the design process?
Sure. Well, programming is the process of determining what is it we want to build here. It's a process where the architect works with the client to establish the performance requirements, the design criteria for the project. And it can really range broadly from identifying the client's goals and objectives for the project to very specific elements, such as the precise characteristics of the space. I've found it to be a really critical communication tool that serves as a reference throughout the project process and establishes and guides the participants in the design process from concept to construction documentation. So the architect typically starts with a general draft, which is then expanded and edited into a final document in that process. I've personally always enjoyed the programming phase, and I'll talk a little bit about an example later on.
Okay, so it's that if I'm kind of summarizing real quickly, it's very difficult for an architect to start design work when they don't know what they're designing exactly. And programming is an attempt to distill information from the client to figure out, well, where do we even start with design? Is that kind of the dummies version of it? That's the Mike version of it.
Yeah, it's really, figuring out what it is you want to build and then putting that together so that everybody understands what it is we're striving to do. And certainly, the first thing that comes up when I was, learning to be an architect was understanding how big a space, spaces you needed, which spaces needed to be next to each other, that sort of thing. But really the program document is a much bigger, has a much bigger purpose because it records a lot of early research and really provides a more precise guide to the architect and the whole design team in designing the project.
Okay, I definitely want to ask you a number of questions to kind of, a little bit later on about some of the, I guess, more nitty-gritty issues with regard to programming and exactly what does the architect do. But I guess one other fundamental question I should get out of the way really quick is this something that architects are going to inherently do when they do their design work, or is this a separate piece of work that needs to be thought about as something that's a bit separate than the other kind of traditional design services an architect's going to be performing?
Yeah, it's really an important component, but is often separated out as something that's done, before, pencil is put to paper or whatever cursor is put to computer screen, um, as a first step to really say, what is it? What is this? In fact, at times, I've seen programs be developed without architecture and start to, build a case for building, going to a board, for instance, getting your arms around what kind of budget we're talking about, how large a building, kind of getting the parameters kind of at a preliminary level, very valuable at that stage.
Okay. And if you were to look at our B100 series document, so if you're familiar with our like B101 or B103, something that you'll see is that programming is considered a supplemental service. It's not a part of basic services, but I think you've kind of laid the case that it is an essential first step to getting into the design phases. Can you talk a little bit about why it is that it's a supplemental service? Why is this not considered part of basic services?
Well, it's really a time-intensive process, and it can be costly, and it can also be a little hard to predict. So it's very difficult to put a dollar number on that for basic services. Basic services, schematic, design development, and on are generally understood phases that you can estimate how much fee would be involved with that, and you can very much get to a scope for those services. Programming is a little bit more for instance, the program could be as simple as a couple of page document that just states, these are the spaces we want, this is how big we want them to be, and this is how we want them to relate to each other, and just end it there. Or it can be a really dense document that talks about values, goals, reuse of existing facilities, standards, things like that. So it's hard to put your arms around that as a basic service. So the B101, for instance, it just presumes that the owner will provide a written program. And there's a space in the initial information that says, if there is indeed a program, you put that in there. And if not, it asks that one describe the process to develop one.
Okay, that makes sense. Colleen, I'd like to bring you into the discussion and talk a little bit about the B202 specifically. Folks that are familiar with our contract offerings will probably know that a B200 series document signifies that it is a scope of services. Can you talk a little bit about how contractually you need to assemble or how a 200 series document like the B200 fits in contractually, what kind of other documents you have to make sure that you have along with it? I don't know if I phrased that correctly, but
yeah, so as you mentioned, it is a scope of services document. It's not a standalone agreement, which means that it would need to pair with a prime agreement that contains all of the terms and conditions for a full contract. So examples of those would be like payment, claims and dispute resolution, termination procedures, copyrights, and overall responsibilities of the parties. Ideally, you would incorporate B202 into an owner-architect agreement, such as the B102, which is an owner-architect agreement without a predefined scope of services, and your B202 would then serve as a programming scope. Alternatively, you could use B202 with the G802 form to amend an existing owner-architect agreement.
Okay, so the big upshot there at least is do not try to use B202 by itself because it's just a description of services. It doesn't have all that other, it has to be attached in some way to an underlying owner-architect agreement. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And the one that we just published in this year, well, actually, maybe I should ask that question. When was this new B202 published? Is that just this spring?
Yes, this year in May 2020. So it's been available for just under 2 months.
Okay, excellent. And I know you, both of you, and the remainder of your task group spent a good amount of time, producing this document. But it's not the first iteration, I understand, of the B202. I understand we had an earlier one from 2009. Can you tell me about, what were some of the things that that your group looked at and focused in on when updating this B202 document?
Yeah, one of the key changes that we focused on was providing a definition of programming that wasn't really explicit in the 2009 version. So we synthesized that down and defined it as identifying and prioritizing values, goals, and objectives to establish performance and design criteria for the project. We also added a provision in the initial information where the owner and architect can describe the scope of the programming services. Another change that we made was modifying the document to reflect updates in the 2017 owner-architect agreements. So for instance, inserting the owner's sustainable objective. And we coordinated B202 partly with the 2019 version of B152, which is an owner-architect agreement for FF&E and design services. The B152 contains a provision dedicated to programming, so we wanted to make sure that those concepts were still in sync with each other. We also included fill-ins to identify the owner's budget and schedule for the project. The previous version was silent on both of those points. And another change we made was simplifying lists throughout the document. There were several provisions that repeated certain concepts and lists, but didn't quite align. So we made it a point to consolidate those and eliminate confusion.
Gotcha. And that idea of budget and schedule is interesting. I imagine a lot of owners, when they want to start their projects, they might come with some lofty ideas, but really the two things that they need to start thinking about are budget and scheduling. I'm surprised that wasn't in there in the previous version. So it sounds like a very good add. So one thing I was thinking about this morning as as I was thinking about this program we're doing, have there been any, when you were going through the process of updating the B202, did you think about or talk about to folks about like any technological advances that might have happened in the last 10, 12 years or so in programming? Is there new software that people are using in programming? And I guess I'll ask that to either of you. Wolf and Colleen, any thoughts or any discussions on those kinds of topics?
We didn't focus on specific types of technology that would aid programming or that have evolved with programming. However, we do incorporate the concept of technology as a topic that the parties should look at and consider as they're going through and designing their space and developing that overall program.
Yeah, I think there's, technology in producing this document. The actual physical act of producing it is, a typical writing process, but there's a lot of activity that happens to get to that document, and understanding standards, visiting facilities, existing facilities, and doing interviews, basically the research. And those things, I guess to the degree that, we're experiencing now with COVID, the interviews can be done in a, you can interview somebody in New York without, having as much of a, hands-on physical presence there, like in a meeting. We're getting very comfortable with this technology. I think the same may be true about site visits even. You know, there may be ways that one could be guided through an existing facility by someone who's there and not require the actual physical presence of the architect there.
Sure. Yeah, I know a lot of, especially nowadays, a lot of architects are wondering how they can do their work without actually going to crowded construction sites.
Right, right.
So I want to get back, Wolf, and ask you a couple of follow-up questions. At least from, you know, if you're an owner who has a relatively small project, you've mentioned that programming and the actual program that's produced by an architect kind of vary in size and scale. If you're working on a residential project or kind of a smaller commercial project, is programming a necessary step? Is this something that can be scaled or even eliminated at a very small project?
Well, you know, we do a lot of multifamily work in our practice on the West Coast, and we don't really get a program. We in those situations we do a lot of multifamily. Our clients are very experienced in it, so there's a sort of shorthand that's developed, and there are some key aspects that we have to define. But in those cases, it's really about maximizing optimizing, I guess is the better word, optimizing the site. So we get some, but even there, we have some basic programmatic questions that we ask about size of units, the mix of units, the amenities. But the program document for most projects, you know, workspace, medical, higher education and such, is a really essential document, because those are very complex buildings that have a lot of moving parts, a lot of pieces, standards that they have to abide by, and the program document is really critical in really getting that into the hands of the design professional to go ahead and actually design the space. You know, after all, we're not experts in everything, and I did an aquarium in the Northwest, the program for an aquarium in the Northwest several years ago, and I really didn't know anything about how you maintain a stellar sea lion, or how you do a display for schools of fish in a huge aquarium tank. And that research was critical to learning about that kind of work. So in that case, you know, the program was essential, and actually a wonderful tool to use to communicate with and to reference.
It's interesting. So you actually had to go around and talk to folks who, you know, worked for the owner, worked for your client, to figure out, well, what are the needs for these different types of, you know, fish and other aquatic life, right?
That's correct. And, you know, it was the owner, the directors of different aspects of the aquarium, also talking with consultants, exhibit designers, for instance, or animal husbandry folks, to really understand what space parameters are, that back of house. How do you get a stellar sea lion from wherever they come from and into the aquarium? And how do you treat them if they get sick? And all those elements we needed to interview, we needed to research, and actually we had to visit many aquariums to go see how that was approached at different facilities.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned all that, because I think that's one easy way to understand why programming is so important. You know, on a typical like residential, like a home design, you've got one or two people typically that you can go to and get all the answers. You know, what size bedrooms do you want? What size rooms in different spaces? But in something that's more complex, and most buildings are, you know, they, you know, of a commercial nature, are pretty complex. You've got a lot of people that you need to get information from in order to make your design decisions. So it sounds like it's why that's such an important step. I can only imagine, starting to do schematic design without having gone through those processes and having to, all right, now I got to talk to the guy about the sea turtles because I don't know what their habitats are supposed to be like.
Right.
So that leads me to one of the first steps in the process that's outlined in that B202 document, which is identifying programming participants. And that's something that the owner, at least by my read through it, the owner and the architect are supposed to do together. Colleen, I'll ask you this one. Can you talk about that identifying programming participants first step, what we're trying to do there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the programming participants are essentially everyone who's involved in designing and using the project. That would certainly be the architect, the architect's consultants, the owner's consultants, specific personnel on the owner's team, end users, so possibly tenants, and stakeholders like boards of directors, government agencies, even community and special interest groups. So if you're building a museum, a library, or historical building, those community special interest groups would certainly be present.
Gotcha. And Wolf, to kind of take your aquarium example through, like what, when you were identifying programming participants, how big of a group are we talking about for a project like that? We're talking about dozens of people or 5 people or something like that?
Yeah, it was a fairly compact group. I would say about 10 to 15 people that we regularly interacted with during the programming process. Many of those participated in our regular meetings with the director and, kind of heard about other aspects of the aquarium. And then, of course, those consultants that I mentioned earlier become important. One thing I was thinking of, I haven't done a program for this, but I have worked with people who have for large office projects. There's the aspect of growth, and again, COVID may change this entirely in the as we go forward. It probably will, but understanding capacity of a space to grow. And really analyzing how workflows happen in an office environment. Those sort of things are also aspects that we get into in the programming phase.
Interesting. So planning for future growth. You can also address that. It's funny you mentioned that. Every time I go through like O'Hare Airport, which of course I haven't flown through there forever, obviously, but I think this thing was designed for a capacity of like 1970, and they've just far exceeded it. And then you go to a newer airport, and it's like, well, clearly they're thinking of capacities for like 2050 and beyond. So that's why it feels so comfortable. But fast forward a little bit, and maybe it won't be when there's more increased traffic to those airports over time.
Right.
So yeah, interesting that those kinds of things get thought about so early on in the design process.
Yeah. Another aspect that comes into play is reuse of facilities too. Programming is not just focused on new buildings. It can be focused on existing buildings and repurposing them or adapting them to new realities in the business or the activity that's engaged there.
Okay. So in those situations, I imagine that almost adds a level of complexity to the programming work that an architect's doing. They've got to not only consider needs from the client, but then they also have to think about, well, how might those needs be addressed by facilities that have real hard parameters to them?
Right, right. Well, I mean, the healthcare institution, which is, governed by, state regulations and, other codes like that, you have to be really careful. I mean, and certainly in the design phase, the architect should be responding to those. But even at the programming stage, understanding the impacts of those regulations on how large a space might have to be, or what pieces have to go along with a particular space, like an OR. So those are important to consider as you're going through programming.
Absolutely. All right, so Colleen, going down the list of the processes for programming, the next thing on the list after selecting programming participants is to have a visioning session. I think to some folks, just hearing the term visioning session, it sounds kind of begs for a little bit more of a definition of what exactly happens. Can you talk about what happens in a visioning session and what is the architect looking to get there?
Sure. So you can think of the visioning session as a brainstorming session where the owner's articulating his big picture or vision for the project. So that would involve all those programming participants that we previously spoke about. They're going to be influencing the design. And the visioning session is meant to be fairly broad because this is the first step of the programming process. And in reality, there may be several visioning sessions before all of the details are ironed out. But during this, the architect is trying to learn about things that are important to the owner or the end user and what they want to accomplish with the project. So they discuss things like technology, aesthetics. The doctor's office will, of course, have very different aesthetics from, say, a church. And they also consider environment, sustainability, and safety. So in prisons, for example, safety is a paramount concern. And health safety now in public spaces is also very crucial.
Sure. So this is a chance really for the architect to learn from the folks who are going to be using the building. You know, what's their big picture goals for how that building's supposed to operate and function, right?
Yes.
Okay. And then so at this stage you've got your participants in the programming, you've had a visioning session, and then the next step, I understand, is to gather information. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of things that the client should be thinking about in terms of, you know, what kind of information does the architect want, are they going to need to get from the client?
Yes, so the architect is going to want to acquire data on the owner's existing facilities, and that might involve land surveys, record documents, environmental criteria, any historical documents and master plans, and also the owner's design and facility standards. So if you have Marriott, for instance, as your client, they will have specific signage requirements, and the lobby will need to certainly have a specific design. It's also important for the architect to gather data from the authorities having jurisdiction to be informed about regulations, codes, and ordinances. And probably lastly, access to the owner's property. Physical access is crucial. Being able to get into the buildings and certainly having access to the relevant personnel of the owner.
Okay. And as part of the information gathering, there's going to be, the architects might be doing interviews as well. So kind of a preliminary question, is the architect going to be interviewing just the programming participants, or is it even a wider net than that of folks that they're going to interview?
It would likely be a wider net. So on the topic of the owner's personnel, you know, the architect wants to hear from the affected employees who use the current space, learn about what works, what doesn't work, and what improvements can be made. Often these are individuals who can offer a perspective that the owner overseeing the project hasn't considered, or they can offer details and suggestions that the owner may be unaware of. The personnel on the ground in the facilities can suggest ideas about workflow processes, things that have always been done the same way because of limitations in the facility's design, which, if they're modified, could increase productivity, save time and money, or lead to greater efficiency.
Excellent. And I assume that just like with identifying programming participants, the owner and architect are going to be working together to figure out who are the right people to interview. Is that part of the process as well?
That is true. Yeah, they would coordinate on that.
Excellent. Something I meant to ask you earlier, Wolf, was, is it common, you mentioned, I think, that you had done the program for the aquarium, but am I correct that you didn't actually do the design, right? You were
Correct.
Now, is that a common setup to have a different architect do the program and then another architect come along and take that program and into design?
Well, in that particular project, we were part of a team, and we did the programming, and then we would be the architect of record. But there was a design architect with, an international reputation that was involved as well, and so it was kind of within the team we were communicating, so that knowledge was ingrained within the team. But yes, I think there are clients that want to get their arms around what their goals are and what they're going to build. So in doing so, they will hire a separate programming architect or a programming professional, which may or may not be an architect, and have them do the program and then use it to solicit for an RFP, or, as I mentioned earlier, it might be starting to get their arms around a budget or seeking approval through a board and such. They may just need that programming document first so they could describe what they're trying to build.
Gotcha.
But I will make a plug for it being integrated and having it as an additional supplemental service to the architect, the design architect, or the building architect's role, because there's that continuity. You learn a lot, and you can document that in a good program, but there's nothing like being there on the ground and seeing these facilities, speaking with the participants in the project, and getting that kind of organically as well.
Absolutely. Maybe we'll just ask a couple of last questions. One, I suppose, is how do you pay for programming services? If I'm a client, first interaction with an architect in a while, how should I, how much should I be thinking about as a percentage of like the overall budget that I might have for the project? And then am I paying the architect hourly or a lump sum? What's kind of a common way to do those things? And I guess I'll open it up to either of you.
Well, I'll jump in. I think there are, it's kind of like doing design. If you're doing a lump sum, you really need to understand the precise scope of work and provide within that fee some contingencies for unforeseen circumstances, like expanded research or anything that may arise during the course of programming that might lead you down a path that you have to explore. But I think early communication with the client can help in that precision and reduce the need for those contingencies. Just basically getting a clarity on what the scope is. And I think a lump sum works. The one thing about a lump sum that you have to be very careful, though, is that scope creep. Again, it's a somewhat flexible process with programming because you make discoveries as you go along, and may drive you in a different direction than you had anticipated. So that communication with the client, giving them an early heads up, is important. Hourly is a more flexible and controllable way to do it. It gives the client certainly much more control, and it reduces the risk to the architect of maybe, you know, going over their fee. But of course, it increases the risk of potential overruns to the client as well, and that demands that the architect maintains detailed records of time and is vigilant and is timely in letting the client know if additional work is required. And that's a basic premise of the B documents, that idea that additional services require notification to the client prior to doing them.
Okay, so Wolf and Colleen, I want to say thanks for coming on and doing this video and talking about programming. Any final remarks or final thoughts about programming generally or the B202 specifically?
I would say for owners and architects out there, don't overlook programming. I think a lot of times there can be a tendency to think that it's unnecessary or it doesn't add much value or it's going to bog the parties down in extra time and money. But it is really crucial to have that solid foundation before you really begin your design work and clarify with all the necessary parties what your overall vision and program for the project is to look like.
Yeah, and I would add that it's a really fun thing to do. It's a very interesting aspect of architectural practice. And as Colleen said, it's really pretty crucial. One last thing I just wanted to mention is that, you know, Colleen and I worked together with others on the task group that developed the new B202. We also reached out to a lot of outside sources, liaisons that provided input and review of the document. So we not only did we have the expertise within that task group, we went nationally for additional expertise.
Excellent. And I'll add my final thoughts is that not every architect can do programming. I did architecture for about 5 years before I went to law school, and I can tell you I reviewed a lot of programs, but I was involved in zero actual programming exercises of a real substantive nature. So it is a highly skilled discipline that is something that, you know, there are architects who are fantastic at it, and then there are architects like myself who have very little to no experience with it. So just it's something to consider when you're thinking about programming. So thank you both very much, and if you have any other questions or issues with regard to AIA contract documents, I'd encourage everyone to go to our documents information webpage, aiacontracts.org, and also check out other videos that we have on YouTube with regard to AIA contracts and other issues. So thank you very much.